When you think of ancient Egypt, what comes to mind? Probably pyramids, right? Pharaohs, golden masks. But what if I told you that image we all have in our heads, it's just scratching the surface? And in a lot of ways, it's completely misleading. So let's get into it. Yeah, this quote really hits the nail on the head. I mean, think about that classic picture of a camel in front of the pyramids. It's the image of Egypt, right? Well, here's the thing. Camels weren't even a big deal in Egypt until way after the pyramids were ancient history. That's a perfect example of what we're talking about. We're going to peel back all those layers of myth and find out the incredible and honestly pretty surprising story of how the civilization actually worked. And that brings us to the big question, the one we're really here to answer. How on earth did Egypt manage to dominate the ancient world for 3,000 years? The secret? Well, it's not just about military might or tons of gold. It's something much deeper, a secret hidden in how they saw the entire universe. All right, to really get Egypt, we have to go back, way back, to the very beginning. And we're not starting with giant monuments or pharaohs. No, we're starting with a desperate fight just to survive in a world that was basically falling apart. Okay, so you can pretty much boil down the entire 3,000-year story of ancient Egypt to one single epic struggle. It's a battle between these two fundamental forces, Ma'at, which is this idea of divine order, truth, and stability, and Isfet, which is the exact opposite, chaos, violence, and destruction. And for the Egyptians, this wasn't just some abstract philosophical idea or a myth. This was real. It was the constant battle that defined their world. And this fight against chaos, it kicked off with a literal force of nature. Imagine this. A massive climate shift turns what was a lush green savanna into the Sahara Desert we know today. All these scattered groups of people are forced to the banks of the Nile River. It's their only lifeline. This catastrophe basically created a pressure cooker, which led to the violent unification of Egypt under its very first god king, a guy named Narmer. It was the first huge move to impose Ma'at, order, onto the chaos of Isfet. And this obsession with order, it shaped everything, even their most incredible invention, writing. The world's first hieroglyphs, they weren't used for epic poems or love stories. Nope. They were found on these tiny little ivory labels used for tracking tax payments. I mean, think about that. Right from the get-go, their greatest innovations were all about one thing: organizing, controlling, and beating back the forces of chaos. So, with this new unified state up and running, they started to flex their muscles, to show off their absolute control in truly monumental ways. Society was organized, the economy was humming, and the pharaohs, well, they set their sights on conquering death itself. Their goal? To create the most orderly, most permanent structures the world had ever seen. And the pyramid, let's be clear, this wasn't some mystical thing built by aliens. It was actually a really brilliant logical step forward. See, royal tombs used to be these simple bench-like buildings called mastabas. But then, this genius architect, Imhotep, he has a radical idea for his king, Djoser. He thinks, hey, what if we just stacked them? One on top of the other, getting smaller as you go up, and boom, you've got a literal stairway to the heavens. Now, you gotta forget that Hollywood image of thousands of slaves being whipped under the hot sun. It's just not true. The pyramids were built by a highly skilled, well-fed, and incredibly organized workforce. I mean, archaeologists have found the city where they lived. It had bakeries, workshops, even medical facilities. And get this, they were eating a staggering amount of prime beef, sheep, and goat every single week. These weren't slaves. These were believers taking part in a massive national project to make sure their king, their god, was immortal, which in turn guaranteed the stability of their entire world. But of course, that perfect order, that perfect ma'at, it couldn't last forever. A perfect storm of environmental disaster combined with a monarchy that was losing its grip, and that allowed Isfet, chaos, to come roaring back with a vengeance. And this shows you the horrifying gap between the ideal and the reality. On one hand, the king was supposed to be this divine provider, the guy who guaranteed the Nile would flood and feed everybody. But then, the floods failed. In ancient texts from the time, they describe a totally grim reality of widespread suffering, starvation. There are even horrifying texts that talk about people eating their own children. And this was all happening under a pharaoh who was being mocked in writing as being well past his prime. The divine contract between the people and their god king was shattered. So with the god king totally powerless, Egypt just shattered. Central authority completely dissolved.
The country broke apart into these little kingdoms ruled by local warlords. And in what was really the ultimate act of chaos, they broke in and desecrated the sacred tombs of the very first kings, severing that physical link to the founders of their entire civilization.
But, chaos often forces you to adapt. And right out of the ashes of civil war and total collapse, a brand new Egypt would rise. And this one was going to be tougher, way more militaristic, and absolutely ready to take on the world. And here's the beautiful irony of it all. The only reason Egypt could reunite and transform into the superpower we call the New Kingdom was because they adopted the cutting-edge military tech. We're talking the composite bow and the war chariot from the very foreign invaders who had just conquered them. They literally learned from the chaos and used its own weapons to bring back order. So this new golden age, right? This is the era of superstars like Tutankhamun and Ramesses the Great. It brought unbelievable wealth and power. But that success, well, it created a whole new set of problems. And this time, chaos wasn't going to come from a drought or an outside invader. No, this time it was coming from inside the house, right from the corridors of power. The first major crack came right from the top. You have this pharaoh, Akhenaten, who basically has this radical religious vision. He declares all the traditional gods of Egypt are finished, and he forces everyone to worship a single god, a sun disk called the Aten. This religious revolution just plunged the country into total chaos. He was so hated that his own successor, King Tut, had his famous tomb filled with Akhenaten's recycled golden treasures. It was a deliberate attempt to literally erase him from history. Now, this carving here, it looks simple, but it carries a subtle and frankly earth-shattering message. For the first time in Egyptian history, the high priest of Amun is shown to be the exact same height as the pharaoh. And if you look really closely, you can see the king is actually standing on a little box just to keep up the appearance of being taller. This was a clear, public statement. The priests, who had become incredibly rich from centuries of donations, now saw themselves as equals to the living God on earth. I mean, for the royals, the writing was, quite literally, on the wall. This one artistic choice was a political earthquake. It was a signal to everyone that the absolute, unquestionable authority of the pharaoh, the very foundation of their society for thousands of years, was crumbling. And this power shift led to the ultimate betrayal. The priests, who were now pretty much the de facto rulers of the country, they officially sanctioned the systematic looting of the Valley of the Kings. I'm serious. They ordered state workers to go in, break into the sacred tombs of pharaohs like Ramesses the Great, strip the mummies of their jewels, and melt down all that ancient gold for the treasury. The very people who were supposed to be the guardians of the afterlife had become its state-sponsored grave robbers. So weakened by all this internal conflict and corruption, Egypt was just a shadow of its former self. It was ripe for the picking. And sure enough, wave after wave of invaders came. But Egypt had one last trick up its sleeve, a secret weapon that was way more powerful than any army. Just look at this succession of conquerors. For nearly 1,000 years, Egypt was ruled by foreigners. You had Libyans, then Cushites from what's now Sudan, then the Assyrians, the Persians, and finally the Greeks under Alexander the Great. From a military perspective, Egypt was done for.
But this is where we see Egypt's final and maybe its greatest secret. It couldn't beat invaders with swords anymore, so it did something even smarter. It absorbed them with its culture. Every single one of these conquering groups went native. The Kushite kings built pyramids in their own land to be more Egyptian. Alexander the Great marched to a remote oasis just to have an oracle declare him the son of an Egyptian god. The Greek Ptolemies, Cleopatra's family, they spent their fortunes building these magnificent Egyptian temples. They all became pharaohs because the idea of Egypt was just too powerful to destroy.
So what if a civilization's greatest strength isn't its ability to resist invaders, but its power to absorb them? After 3,000 years, the ultimate secret to Egypt's incredible longevity wasn't its armies or even its pyramids. It was the irresistible gravity of its culture, an idea of divine order so powerful that it outlasted empire after empire, turning conquerors into believers and ensuring that, in the end, Egypt always, somehow, conquered its conquerors.